You know, playing a piece is not the sum of the details of it. It's the storytelling that relates a lot to the transitions. Because the thematic materials are God-given through the composer, who, anyway, defines what we're going to do with the piece, because in part the piece talks to you, harmonic, rhythmic, more than rhythmic, the pulse. And then the simple atmosphere that is so personal between you and the piece cannot be described. Everybody has a love relationship that they feel the love to be in love, and you cannot describe it unless you live it. You can define it, you can perhaps, it's like teaching anatomy versus soulful description of the personality. Some are factual and some are spiritual, and the music, even if it's famous piece, it means so many different things to so many different people. In other words, it means something special to each who plays it. Of course, you have the listeners who are active, yearning, hoping, dreaming, imagining, daydreaming, entering in a passionate discourse with the music that you deliver, agreeing or disagreeing with your interpretation according to who they prefer play the piece in their own pantheon of recordings or performers. And in that very intimate relation with the piece, which evolves with time, it reveals itself to you differently. It's not just the struggle to play it clean and well, and then to memorize it in details in order to restore it as close to what your ideal of the piece is. And then you hear it by others, played or taught by others, and you attend recording sessions or perhaps master classes. You read articles about the pieces. You understand that people have spent a lot of time entering between the notes to describe them in words, to place them in a context, to give you an idea about where and how to dig from in order to present what it is for you that it means. And I find that at some point you have to be very careful with the student in order for the student to express what is their own intuition. You cannot just pour knowledge over the intuition and hope that the mix will pick up somehow some kind of tasteful coagulation of the elements. No, I don't think so. I think it's life itself. Just like a good conductor knows what to say and what not to say during a rehearsal time, because they would know what would get fixed through the rehearsals by the musicians individually, fine-tuning, finessing the elements. It doesn't have to be told and asked in public at the rehearsal, or humiliate if it's not good in public. It's never positive. No more than a misread note by a student I call misguessed, because I want them to feel very confident that their intuition is their drive. And if I consider that artistically, stylistically, the frame in which they place their soundscape, as an analogy with a painting, doesn't overwhelm, nor does it underestimate the importance of the element that you're watching in the painting and the element that you're hearing in the music. All these are very subtle concepts. It's not just spoon-feeding, so to say, an element or two, and it will be disrespectful to the student's own inner life. Of course, students come to ask you about how fast, how slow, basic questions, pedal here or there. I like to think that their questions are not really the reflection of their inner world. I think they're just trying to get factual answers, to perhaps get comforted in their own intuition, or perhaps refute it, or be refuted by the teacher's opinion. But the teacher carries their own traditions, which in a way is the way to call it quoting, I think is very important to manage the dialogue with the student for what it means to them. And of course, you can argue with the score because the indications by the publisher attributed to the composer. Yeah, if the composer needed to put, or the publisher, all these indications in words, then what's the point of the music itself, the language itself? You don't need to translate it. Or is it because you don't feel it? Then you have to read it to make sure it's expressive or driven, allegro or presto or con fuoco, fiery. Okay, it's a way to describe the text, but then you don't need a subtext when you're a musician with a score. You need what the music produces. This beautiful mix, this enchanted moment between harmony, pulse, melody, atmosphere, modulation. You can call all these things in music theory language. Ultimately, it's in performance about emotion and atmosphere. Of course, there is a lot of cerebral organization going around. How to organize the GPS of the structure of the piece. How to prepare these transitions for which I was speaking earlier, because they determine a lot if you merge into the second theme under the tempo to pick it up again when it starts like a bump, instead of making it so smoothly and so proportionally that you enter into the new theme like you merge in traffic of another highway after you left the earlier highway, and you're always in motion. And I find that very often the great compositions are not only the ones that have this incredible given thematic material that grabs your heart and go, oh, how beautiful. And you don't even put any rationale to how beautiful. Doesn't need to. And then you have in the formal aspect of things, weaker moments where it's necessary to go from one point to another. And what kind of transition do you use? How do you over thematize it or just let it be the most neutral possible? How do you choose what to express from what to impress when you play with? In other words, you play the piece and you don't want to be on top of it narrating it with added levels of layers of musical expression, as if like, look how sensitive and meaningful this transition is. Just let it happen. It's difficult to play without to involve yourself fully, because you feel as a young student often that you don't give it all the time for each note, because each gesture, interval, emotion, appoggiatura, suspension, any affect, all these elements which bring the discourse to be so unique, like the beloved person's voice or perfume, and you cannot describe it. You just can live it again. It's a very personal interaction between the piece and the performer. And since the composer is mostly dead and the performer's teacher is mostly alive, then the teacher becomes this hyphen between this idealized intemporal statement of a composer through a printed page, and how it comes alive. It's fine-tuning. Who determines good taste from bad? Who determines enough rubato from too much? Who determines the right way to play this ornament on the beat or not before? This arpeggio delay the harmony long. This phrase always reach its if not peak, at least blossom, and then some kind of decay? Or do you just connect them until it becomes a further bridge that leads to further in the piece? And so in a way it's like an editor in a film who gives you the tempo of the events and not just the raw scenes. Um, Very often, a great film can be even better if it's the pulse rhythm of the editing confers to it a dimension that you wouldn't have just by the quality of the individual scenes. In that sense, this is an analogy with the transition in the sonata form. Then you have the restatements, the rehashings. People used horses and traveled slowly and longed a lot. The longing was part of the romantic experience of piano in the 19th century, expressing the mood of people's poems, paintings, sculptures, novels. It peopled their inner worlds without to be paced like today, marvelously in a way, instantaneously, constantly anyway. And so to replunge in this psychology of the events that ended up in a ballade or in a scherzo by Chopin or in a novel or in a poem, regardless the form of the expression, it is a form of an expression of human experience of longing, hoping, loving, fearing, hating, rejecting, a sense of inner turmoil, inner shiver. The pedaling, the phrasing, the acoustics, the resonance, the length of sound of the modern piano, in a way enhances more what the instruments could do in the past, which already was inevitably their own, obviously, time. They didn't think they are romantic or they were Baroque or they're Renaissance. We call them all that. They were modern and contemporaries for their time, contemporum, and etymologically at the same time. And I find that ultimately, when we define that we're not supposed to be that expressive in a crescendo, diminuendo, hairpin, as we call in music, right? For some countries, you have an emotional peak and drop. How high it goes and how dropped it is after is so much in your rapport to elegance as a person, in your education, in your the way your parents brought you up, if you had the chance to have such. Then you have the, of course, incredible amount of education that you receive, that you seek, that you complete either by academics, either by just pure playing, not just imitating, but also by rejection, finding your own. Ultimately, it's a journey that is so, again, as I said earlier, personal, between you and the piece. Not just the sum of details, not just the only, but also often not limited to horse ride or horse competition where the cavalier and the horse have to go through obstacles. Because very often when you're in the first meeting with the piece and you try to learn it, then memorize it, then perform it in front of people and realize that you don't control much of it. Every time different piano, different acoustics. You fear some sections more than others, but usually the ones you don't fear happen to not go well because you feel perhaps uncomfortable to share such intimacy with another person or group of persons. But you have to learn how to bring your piece with you to them, like a partner of chamber music, literally, even if dead, but alive during the performance, always new, always renewed. And then you experience that piece and you realize that, in fact, it owns you more than you ever can control it, no matter how much you practice the details to be reliable by repetitivity. Because ultimately, there is one time to play through when you play in person in public. And if you record, you can always retake. And when you retake, you rethink. And when you rethink the sections and the systems, in fact, you're a little bit the architect and a little bit the composer and a little bit the poet and a little bit the conductor and the orchestra, the imaginary of all of these elements that you suggest with the piano playing. And that can evolve through your understanding of the piece, from tempi changes in time to dynamic ranges and essential choices of what to bring out and what to keep inward and what to be extroverted and what to be introverted, and how the pedal has to coat the harmony without to smear with the preceding harmony, so that you can catch the tail of the comet of the resonance. But then you do finger legato, and then the touch that corresponds to repeated notes that are melodic when you play it. You can sing, I want to tell you how much I would like to dance with you, or something. You don't hear the repeated notes when they're singing because they have different syllables. And on the piano, it's a percussive instrument, so we're in denial that we can sing with it. But in fact, it's because we believe in it that we imagine that we can. And we don't just play fully up and down the key, and eventually with the right foot pedal, legato, but then it's 88 tempers up. It makes the sound very resonant because the beautiful resonance of the crossed strings piano allows you to have rich overtones, and you lose the intimacy of the connection of this note to the next, either over legato by holding, either just simply by articulating. So the air legato, the detached, or the, you can call it the tenuto. People call differently the same things, but the point is that when they play them, the composers don't always give you the choice between the step motion or a beautiful leap of expression of love when you lift up the sixth or the octave, something more heroic in the, again, innuendo. If you go at 10th, is like the big leap of faith. I mean, everybody can call differently all these different elements or their significance sensually, intellectually, emotionally, but that's okay. I accept the alterity. I accept the tolerance of the difference of approach. I'm not here to impose mine. I'm here to suggest mine, not only by example, but also by some explanation. After all, it doesn't take away from the spontaneity of the intuition to organize a group of bars that organize a structured phrase, and then how you bring it beyond the bar lines of the score of the notation, because very often the notation doesn't really translate for practical purposes or traditional purposes of the notation of the time. All this timelessness that is embedded there, how the bar lines are constantly overlapped by the phrase, and you have hemiolas within 3/4 in 6/8, or 2 bars that make a 3/2. You have different pacing and different phrasing. You feel like the bars are disturbing you visually. You should imagine them like the page is barless, and you just play the flow of the emotional flux and reflux. Of course, that is easier to do once you know the piece, because you learned it with those limitations of spaces. But if you only visually look at those bars that are so well equally, evenly distributed through the page, it gives you a sense of visual calm, that something is organized and it's well displayed. But in fact, when the playing of the intent of the composer, I think the notation vanishes, evaporates in terms of its structure, especially the bar lines. Thank God people don't hear the bar lines. Because upbeat, downbeat, heavy downbeat, light upbeat, or opposite or equal, it depends so much of the context. And in any case, the statement of music has to be something that corresponds to your intimate understanding of the meaning of it. It's so easy for me to say all these words because it's a sum of thoughts and reflections upon teaching and playing and myself aging with pieces that I have as partners for life, which reveal themselves so refreshingly differently, not per se constantly, because it would be unfair to say something so ridiculous, but in fact, in subtle ways they do, in ways we can't even put words on it. So when we always wonder which edition do you use, I think it's so superficial. It's like as if you feel different in the rain because you have a different raincoat. Of course, it is or it's not your raincoat, but ultimately, it's the rain that matters. How do you capture that sensuality that touches your skin? And how does it translate in music? There are composers who translate this in sounds. Just like painters freeze it on a canvas, and then you feel like it's not frozen. You feel like it's constantly in motion. Illusions, innuendos, a lot of technique lies on the base of any artistry. And of course, in the ideal presentation, it has to vanish so that the artistry appears to be just the essence of the gesture, just a phrase, a line, a horizon line. It's so inspirational because in chamber music, you share the piece with the musicians in real time, and they play with different instruments than you, especially when you're on the piano. There's no 4 piano quartets usually, it's always with strings, winds, or singers. So there is a synergy between different ways of approaching the melodic line with or without lyrics, with or without bowing, with or without breathing, and when and where, and what is an andante for a wind player compared to a pianist with pedal that can intellectually, exponentially expand the bars artificially to a certain extent. But what is not artificial? Art, by essence, comes from artifice. It's life recreated, idealized, like the dances of the Baroque suites, which are stylized, or Ravel's valses, which are not to be danced, even if you could try. That's not the point. It's the evocation. It's the reminiscence. It's the nostalgia. Is the memory of something that, of course, the young student hasn't lived to regret or to hope to recapture, like the composer hints in the piece. And you cannot do that before it happens to their own cycle of their own life experience. Of course, actors learn how to act. They don't have to go through the experience of the character in order to play it, but it can be more believable. There are different techniques about that. Necessarily not, for instance, in theater, some people in teaching theater say that the text is the horse and you're the riding the horse, so you are partner with the text, and how you space it, how you pace it, how you say it, at which level of intensity, it's so personal. But then, of course, you have a director who tells you how to say, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you, oh, I hate you. Of course, in music, we have the pitches and the rhythms indicated in the score, so we could say, oh, all I have to do is the craftsmanship of playing the music, and if once I play it exactly like it is, I don't have to recreate it. It's already there. Just put alive, bring alive, away from the music score, because at some point it's through your body, your psyche, your own imagination, perhaps, of times past, which they didn't do so much in their past, since most of the music of Chopin, Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn were played, Scarlatti, Bach, and before, and Frescobaldi, was played in their own time, for their own time, with their own time's audience and performers. So there wasn't so much like today this capacity to museal capacity of playing music of so many different time periods on an instrument that doesn't correspond with the ears that don't hear it the way it was tuned, the way it was, the length of sounds, the polyphony of the equals, of the layers of the voices, who overlaps, who doesn't resonate enough or too much according to acoustics or instrument with pedal like piano. yes, to a certain extent, we betray the music of other time periods because we imagine how it's supposed to have been, but still, according to going through our own psyche of today. Of course, we have incredible musicologists and scholars who plunge us, or biographers, in music history and then music theory to explain to us the harmonic progressions that define a specific style, genre, time period, and how you express it or how you're supposed to express it. And again, we go there into the unknown territory, since nobody recorded how they played those unmeasured rhythms like the grace notes or the group notes that are unmeasured but an arpeggio on the beat, before the beat, between the beat, with the melody, delaying the melodic note, expressively delaying it, or just by the dynamic range, or without it, by the difference of articulation. And you have this variety of touches that can be the, in fact, expression before the dynamic range on the fortepiano came to prevail over the articulation on the harpsichord and the fortepiano. So progressively, we gained in power and whisper in greater concert halls projection or in recording sessions where we have microphones that capture the slightest innuendo. But you have to say something through all this. A sentence, a statement, a meaning. A simple statement is the hardest thing to do, even if it's codified by the score. And of course, like the art directors or the stage directors, the teachers and the conductors tell you how to do it, how to count it, how to think it, how to organize the ornamentation and all. So yeah, you're obedient, you have a rehearsal, you want to produce a good performance, so everybody goes towards one direction. But then another conductor comes, another musicologist writes an article, another teacher comes and says this tradition is better than the other. You play the dotted rhythms like triplets in Baroque because they're aligned, but who knows that they were always aligned? Or the grace notes are always equalized, but not always. If not, why would they write them like that? So the notation brings us to think. The performance and the rehearsal, the recording, make us able to, again, sink in the details that I was just describing a few of them. When the listener or yourself should trend to try to be going through the phrase, the statement, it has to englobe all of these details without to show them. If they're missing, it's sort of empty, boring. If there are too many, it's overwhelming and perhaps unnatural. And how do you define how much of the ingredients blend correctly in this genre or that style, in this mazurka or that sarabande, but stylized on the piano? That's why teaching is probably closest to most important, because it's a true exchange. Perhaps we don't always find the words, perhaps we do it just by playing through. Perhaps we define something too much and other things not enough. Every teacher insists on different elements of the same piece, and then the student slowly builds up in their own path of learning what they keep or what they reject, what they construct from what they deconstruct, from what they receive, that believe or disbelieve or reject or just admire, not knowing why, no more than why they reject. But ultimately, it's all about the piece itself, not how we describe it when we play it. And so you have to bring the students to find themselves closest to the piece itself, so they don't have the impression that in interpretation is a travesty or perhaps a betrayal. And the factual elements on the notation can't fulfill 100% of all, because there is always this element between the words, between the notes, the breath, the change of bow, the direction of line, this restarting of a second 16th note in group of 4 in Bach. And how do you do that articulation, re-articulation, re-impulsing? It's all in the subtleties of the details, of the hints. That's why teaching is the greatest way to learn.